Movie remakes are designed to make money. Now, that's not a judgment on them, and it's not to say that they can't be good, but nobody was asking for a new live-action Beauty and the Beast or Lion King because there's nothing wrong with the originals. You can still watch them, and they're still great. And yet the remakes of those movies are the 8th and 18th highest grossing films of all time. Name recognition counts, studios are risk-averse, and star power sells. So Disney is planning 10 more. Video game remakes make for a fascinating contrast. There's still a commercial imperative, obviously. Modern game development is expensive, even if remakes are cheaper. But there's also a compelling cultural argument. Not only are old games not always available to purchase, they also age in a way that films just don't. The advancement of both technology and game design mean that our expectations of what a game should be are constantly changing. Most older games are less like black and white films and more like zoetropes, historical artifacts that have been robbed of their original impact. The best 2D games have escaped that purgatory. By the SNES era, 2D art could be richly detailed, and time had allowed for a certain mastery of mechanics. Indie games have now revisited this era enough that 2D mechanics and aesthetics have been repopularised, making the classics feel more familiar. For the games in the early 3D hinterlands, however, time has been a cruel mistress. The chunky polygons, bad aliasing, low-res backgrounds and pushchair on ice control schemes make many PS1, N64 and Saturn games a tough ask for most modern gamers. Yet while the mechanics and the visuals are dated, the story and setting and atmosphere survive. The benefit of a remake is to retain the things that haven't aged and improve the things that have. Conveniently for this video, 2002's Resident Evil is often considered the quintessential video game remake. Preserving the setting and structure of the original, the remake represented a quantum leap in graphics and sound design over just a 6-year period. Photorealistic backgrounds were complemented by higher resolution models, positional audio, ambient lighting and improved animations. Retaining the fixed camera angles integral to the design and atmosphere of the original, the game also tweaked and expanded upon its story and setting, improving the experience for newcomers and series veterans alike. It was arguably the best looking game of its entire generation, and it remains perhaps the definitive survival horror experience. The Resident Evil 2 remake arrived in this context, and it didn't let the side down. The first Resi remake in 17 years wasn't quite of the same bar-setting standard as its predecessor, but it was a worthwhile endeavour. While cutting back on the original's 4 scenarios, 2 slightly divergent routes for each character, the remake added a new mission for 2 supporting characters. More pointedly, it marked a dramatic reinvention of combat for the franchise, introducing zombies with detachable limbs and lurching, stuttering movement, charging each encounter with a series of rapid, high-stakes decisions. It also reinvented the iconic enemy known as Mr. X. Appearing without warning or context, this 7-foot stalker is a relentless and omnipresent threat that pursues you throughout the game and heightens its already considerable tension. You can see then how the Resident Evil 3 remake had a lot to live up to. Yet to really understand the remake and what was actually at stake, you first need to know what they were remaking. The original Resident Evil 1 and 2 were, not to put too fine a point on it, epochal games. The first one not only laid the template for an entire subgenre with its control scheme, camera, atmosphere and puzzles, it also straight up made zombies cool again. The massive popularity of both it and the lesser House of the Dead games spawned a wave of Asian zombie movies and inspired the likes of The Walking Dead, Shaun of the Dead and 28 Days Later. Resi 2 stoked that fire, but in a video game context, it also marked a move to more action-oriented gameplay, and cemented Raccoon City as one of the great locations in horror gaming. It's not a slight on Resident Evil 3 Nemesis to say that it wasn't that revolutionary. When you look at its history, it didn't have any such aspirations. Riding that wave of popularity, the game was intended as a spin-off to fill the gap between bigger releases. When the game originally planned to be Resi 3 was scrapped in mid-1998, and that team was shuttled onto what would become Resident Evil 4, the team and concept behind Resi 3 were expanded. Even then, a third game, Resident Evil Code Veronica, was stealing the limelight as an exclusive for the next generation Dreamcast. It was in this context that Resi 3 landed on the aging PlayStation after little more than a year in the lab. Despite this tumultuous development, the game was rapturously received. Reuniting players with Resi 1 protagonist Jill Valentine, it not only revealed more of Raccoon City, but introduced the titular, tentacular Nemesis. Similar in some respects to Mr. X, Nemesis was notable for being the first enemy that could pursue you through doors, and the first that could wield weapons. The sanctity of an empty room was suddenly and violently shattered, a rug pull that made pursuits through the ruins of Raccoon City a uniquely dramatic experience. While the short development time meant that there was only one scenario, the game made up for this by introducing new weapons, an ammo crafting mechanic, and narrative choices in key moments, leading you through different areas and towards different endings. If you want a more modern analogy, at least by my standards, Resi 3 is kind of like the Fallout New Vegas of the franchise, a game that was better than it had any right to be given the circumstances of its development. What the remake had to contend with then was an outsized reputation. Not just of the original, the brilliance of which was a minor miracle, but that of its predecessor. And in true Capcom fashion, it would have to do it on a similar timescale. With the success of Resi 7, Capcom had decided on a yearly release schedule. The Resident Evil 3 remake would launch a year after Resi 2 and a year before Resident Evil Village. Now, this was an immediate red flag. Game development has moved on even since New Vegas, and while you can technically always throw enough resources at a problem to fix it, a year development cycle for a modern game will always be a big ask. It would be impressive if the game had managed to replicate the content of the original in that time frame, let alone improved upon it to the extent required of a remake. Whatever we got, it was always going to struggle to meet expectations. But here's the thing. The game came out, it didn't review particularly well, and I didn't buy it. That's all historical record. But the distance between then and now has seen a minor fan reappraisal of the game, and it's given me the distance I think I needed from the Resi 2 remake. The result, surprisingly, is a game I really enjoyed. The premise of the game is simple. Counting down the days until she can leave Raccoon City, Special Forces operative Jill Valentine's time runs out. As the virus from the Spencer Mansion incident spreads, Jill is chased from her home by another of Umbrella's experimental bioweapons, the gun-toting Nemesis. Searching for a way out of the city, she ends up in an unlikely partnership with Carlos Oliveira, one of Umbrella's hired guns. The first thing to say is that everything that made the last remake great is still here. The art direction is tremendous. I love the environment, starting in Jill's cluttered apartment and moving through the alleys, streets and shops of Raccoon City. A bit too much is made of the RE engine, but it definitely gives the artists at Capcom a platform to shine. I played the game on an ultra-wide monitor, which is the main reason that this is a podcast and not a proper episode, and as bad as it is for YouTube, it gives you a fantastic appreciation of the game's environments. While less claustrophobic than Resi 2's station halls and sewers, the number of enemies has been ramped up, and each area is a dance between shambling hordes, parked cars and neon-lit scenery. These open areas also allow the game to revive the original's dodge mechanic. Having been extremely inconsistent in that game, to the point that it was barely worth using, the window to hit it has been increased slightly here. In the tighter areas, this can turn combat into a miniature rhythm game, as you chain carefully timed button presses to weave through packs of enemies. Fail any one of these, of course, and chaos reigns, particularly on higher difficulties. The zombies are as unpredictable as ever, staggering and screeching their way through the streets and skulking behind the clutter. With enough distance from the last game, just roaming around and shooting zombies is a joy. The city certainly isn't big, and it pales in comparison to the open level design of the original, where you could choose which order to explore and find key items in. But there are at least a few Metroidvania-style shortcuts you can unlock to pass back through areas, and enough little goodies to reward exploration. Enemy variety is solid, though there's nothing unexpected for series veterans. Both hunters are here, and they are challenging on hardcore, with one room requiring a solid dozen attempts. The Drain Demos have arguably been upgraded, and the maze-like warren they occupy was a real highlight. Their attack and kill animations are among the most disturbing in the franchise, something I'm pleased the recent games have gone back to. Speaking of animations, no review of this game would also be complete without an appreciation of the character models. While Claire in the RE2 remake was slightly contentious, I didn't have a problem with her personally, and I think her scenario blows Leon's out of the water, although that's an argument for another video. Jill looks great here. The character models and animations in recent Resi games are among the best in the industry in my opinion, and both Jill's face model and voice actress are a superb fit. They're close enough to her previous outings that the character is recognisable, but different enough to stand out. Jill was always tough, but she was a pretty stoic action hero, largely unperturbed by the events around her. The remake puts Jill through the ringer, and her wry barbs and foul-mouthed tirades make her a more relatable character. I could do without Carlos's Pomeranian haircut, but I generally love the new character designs, and their fleshed out roles mean you'll be seeing a bit more of them. This all comes across in the game's cinematics, another flourish that undoubtedly does improve on the original. But boy, are there a lot of cinematics. Not just in the form of cutscenes, many of which are great, but what amount to interactive cutscenes where Jill jogs through a gauntlet of linear set pieces. They are enjoyable in a dumb action movie kind of way, but it's another noticeable limit on the original game's semi-open world. Those limits start to add up as the story progresses. The absence of a couple of beloved areas from the original game was well publicised before release, though the inclusion of one of them as set dressing, looming in the background of a boss fight, is a particularly cruel tease. However, I can't say I minded this as much as some people seem to. The game has inevitably been cut down, with more areas removed than were added, but those missing cogs don't break the machine. The story still flows naturally, and the levels are punchy and polished. Where the RE2 remake sagged a bit in its later stages, I actually enjoyed this the longer it went on. Later levels are a jamboree of different enemy types, each with different vulnerabilities. After the action-heavy mid-game, the underground areas are a change of pace and atmosphere, and demand that you carefully manage both your ammo and inventory. For all the boss fights that have been removed, and there are a couple, the survivors largely make up for it. This isn't a Cuphead level showcase, but I enjoyed pretty much all of the encounters with Nemesis. The last two in particular were enormous fun, with scenery to interact with and mobs impeding your progress. Figuring out his patterns and weaknesses is about as close as you'll get to puzzle solving in this game, though again, that's nothing new after RE2. This review has probably run almost as long as the game at this point, and that is a legitimate contention. It's an 8-hour game at a push, and not one with a lot of replayability. Fans of the original are guaranteed to be disappointed at the things that have been left out and the lost promise of what they might have looked like. But it's because the rest of the game is so good and looks so good that these omissions particularly rankle. Remove yourself from those expectations, distance yourself from the RE2 remake, or come to this completely fresh, and I think you will enjoy it. Resident Evil 3 is undeniably entertaining, mechanically excellent, well acted, well paced, and visually impressive. It's an action romp you can complete in a couple of evenings, and that's no bad thing in an era of endless RPGs. But it is also everything its critics said it is. The RRP is too expensive by half, and it's close enough to its predecessor that it occasionally feels like a high-end DLC. None of that is mutually exclusive. Judged by my own criteria, Resident Evil 3 is a failed remake. It neither builds on the potential of the original or preserves that game to a degree that makes it redundant. Some Resi fans may not be able to extricate themselves from that, and I understand that, but I don't think new players will need to. They'll find a game that works on its own merits, and one that's potent enough to get them interested in the others. As a long-time fan of the franchise, that's good enough for me. Thank you very much for listening, as it was. This was an experiment with a slightly shorter podcast format, both to get episodes out more quickly and allow me to review games that I can't easily capture. Let me know what you thought down in the comments, chuck me a like and a subscribe if you're so inclined, and I'll see you again soon. Take care.